The Vatican Museums are the public museums of the Vatican City. They display works from the immense collection amassed by the Catholic Church and the papacy throughout the centuries, including several of the best-known Roman sculptures and most important masterpieces of Renaissance art in the world. The museums contain roughly 70,000 works, of which 20,000 are on display, and currently employ 640 people who work in 40 different administrative, scholarly, and restoration departments. Pope Julius II founded the museums in the early 16th century. The Sistine Chapel, with its ceiling and altar wall decorated by Michelangelo, and the Stanze di Raffaello, decorated by Raphael, are on the visitor route through the Vatican Museums. Considered among the most canonical and distinctive works of Western and European art. In 2024, the Vatican Museums were visited by 6.8 million people. They ranked second in the list of most visited art museums and museums in the world after the Louvre. There are 24 galleries or rooms in total, with the Sistine Chapel notably being the last room visited within the museum. The Vatican Museums trace their origin to a single marble sculpture purchased in the 16th century. Laocoon and his Sons was discovered on the 14th of January, 1506. In a vineyard near the Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore in Rome. Pope Julius II sent Giuliano da Sangallo and Michelangelo, who were working at the Vatican, to examine the discovery. On their recommendation, the Pope immediately purchased the sculpture from the vineyard owner. The Pope put the sculpture, which represents the Trojan priest Laocoon and his two sons, Antiphontes and Thymbraeus, being attacked by giant serpents, on public display at the Vatican exactly 1 month after its discovery. Benedict XIV founded the Museum Christianum, and some of the Vatican collections formed the Lateran Museum, which Pius IX founded by decree in 1854. The museum celebrated their 500th anniversary in October 2006 by permanently opening the excavations of a Vatican Hill necropolis to the public. The Vatican Museums themselves were originally founded as collections of works of classical archaeology. The popes viewed themselves as the legitimate heirs of Roman history. The pagan capital had turned Christian. The Imperium of Augustus and Trajan was merged into the Imperium Sine Fine of the Catholic and Apostolic Church. The monuments of the Roman civilization, therefore, had to be preserved, safeguarded, and revered ad maiorem Dei gloriam, and for the honor and glory of the Church. In 1506, the original nucleus of the Vatican Museum's classic works was set up in the Cortile del Statue, today known as the Octagonal Court. Here, Pope Julius II, Della Rovere, displayed an impressive collection of ancient sculptures, including the Apollo Belvedere and the Laocoon, which had just been rediscovered after centuries buried on Esquiline Hill. It was also Julius II who, in 1508, tasked Michelangelo Buonarroti with updating the decoration of the Sistine Chapel. The chapel, originally called the Cappella Magna, got its new name when Pope Sixtus IV, Della Rovere, 1471 to 1484, had it restored. Julius II inaugurated the Sistine Chapel with Michelangelo's splendid new ceiling at a solemn high mass on All Saints' Day, the 1st of November, 1512. Julius II also commissioned the decoration of Raphael's rooms. As the Pope did not want to live in the same rooms used by his predecessor, Alexander VI, he commissioned Raffaello Sanzio da Urbino to decorate certain rooms in a wing that Nicholas V had built in the mid-15th century. Pope Julius II gave Raphael free rein to create frescoes and artworks as he wished, a grand project which would continue under Pope Leo X de' Medici, 1513 to 1521. This section includes the Room of the Segnatura, 1508 to 1511, the Room of Heliodorus, 1511 to 1514, the Room of the Fire in the Borgo, 1514 to 1517, and the Room of Constantine, 1517 to 1524. The frescoes in this last room were painted mostly by Raphael's students. The master had died suddenly on the 6th of April, 1520. Meanwhile, in 1508, the architect Donato Bramante had begun work on the loggia. On his death in 1514, Raphael was called upon to take over the project. Raphael, together with his students, also painted the frescoes on the second floor of the loggia, and they are seen as his answer to his rival Michelangelo. As in the Sistine Chapel, the themes and subjects are, for the most part, drawn from the book of Genesis. It was also Raphael whom Pope Leo X tasked with the decoration of the Room of the Chiaroscuri. Gregory XIII, Boncompagni, a hardened and cultured counter-reform pope, commissioned the great mathematician and cosmographer Ignazio Danti. Along with a team of painters led by Girolamo Musiano, to complete a truly grandiose project, documenting Italy's geography with 40 large-scale maps covering the walls of an entire room near the Sistine Chapel. The Gallery of Maps was opened in 1581. It is a monumental lesson in map-making and a marvelous example of the harmony of scientific accuracy with artistic expression. The hall is 120 meters long and 6 meters wide, and its frescoed maps represent the regions of Italy, its major islands, Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica, and the minor ones, Trimiti, Elba, Malta, and Corfu. Here, the Pope could take a walking tour of Italy without leaving the palace. Antonio Pinelli, La Galleria delle Carte Geografiche, 1994. The inscription that serves as the dedication for the work, Regio Totius Urbis Nobilissima, unequivocally reveals Gregory XIII's vision of Italy, the most noble country in the world. The term nobilissima is meant to convey history, memory, culture, variety, art, and beauty. The Gallery of Maps was restored during the reign of Pope Urban VIII, 1623 to 1644, who also designated a small room for liturgical functions in the Borgia Tower adjoining Raphael's rooms. In 1631, this newly renovated ornate room with its lunette vault ceiling and gold-leafed plasterwork became the Pope's private chapel and is known as the Chapel of Urban VIII. A crucial 50-year period in Europe between the Enlightenment, Revolution, Empire, and Restoration also saw renewal and radical transformation in the papal collections. From the second half of the 18th century onward, discoveries from excavations in Rome and Lazio and acquisitions from collectors and antique dealers led to significant expansions in the collections. Soon, with the influence of the ideas of the Enlightenment, the museums of the Pope were transformed into a museum in the modern sense, one whose purpose is to protect works of ancient art and to promote the study and knowledge of the artworks. It was a period of great turmoil, but one that also gave birth to the oldest and most fascinating part of the Vatican's collections, the Pio Clementino Museum. The founding of the museum was the work of two popes who both hailed from Italy's Emilia-Romagna region, Clement XIV, Ganganelli, and Pius VI, Braschi. The creation of the octagonal court dates from the 1770s. The plan, devised by architect Michelangelo Simonetti, was a reworking of Julius II's Antiquarium of Statues. Here, Roman skies look down on unparalleled masterpieces of sculpture dating back to antiquity. The Laocoon, the Apollo Belvedere, the Venus Felix and the Belvedere Hermes, as well as Antonio Canova's Perseus Triumphant and the Pugilists. The Pio Clementino Museum's other sections surround the court like the points on a compass rose. the Hall of Animals. The Hall of the Muses. The Round Hall. The Gallery of the Statues and the Hall of Busts. The Cabinet of Masks and the Gallery of the Candelabra. It is noteworthy that the artworks in the Pio Clementino Museum are displayed within a perfectly fitting architectural and decorative setting. The harmony between artworks and surroundings is something to be admired in itself. It was also Pius VI who, around 1790, created the Vatican Museum's first collection of paintings, 118 priceless works. In 1797, however, following the Treaty of Tolentino signed with Napoleon, the Papal States were forced to surrender the Pio Clementino Museum's greatest masterpieces, including the most important works in the painting collection, to France. Pope Pius VII, Chiaramonti, added so many works to the collections of classical antiquities that the new Chiaramonti Museum was created. Its founding in 1806 marks an important moment in the history of the Vatican collections, which had been so severely reduced when numerous works were taken to France in accordance with the Treaty of Tolentino, 1797. The new museum was created thanks to the efforts of a wide-reaching campaign of purchases from antique dealers and excavators working in the Papal States. The Congress of Vienna, 1815, and the diplomatic efforts of Antonio Canova, Inspector General of the Fine Arts and the Vatican Museums, made it possible to recover almost all of the previously seized artworks. The area where Pius VII's collection is displayed also features a number of masterpieces of antiquity. Canova also dictated the criteria according to which the Chiaramonti Museum's displays were organized. His aim was to present the three sister arts together: sculpture, represented by the ancient works on display; architecture, in the form of shelves made from ancient architectural pieces; and painting, frescoes carried out by young artists of the time. In 1816, the first regulation of the Vatican Museums was drafted to regulate access to the public and to establish the conservation staff's responsibilities. Renowned conservation technicians were assigned to care for the collections. When the works seized by Napoleon were returned, it became necessary not only to reorganize the papal collections, but also to build a new section for classical sculpture. Thus, in 1822, Pope Pius VII inaugurated the new wing. Raffaele Stern was the architect for the project, while Antonio Canova handled the arrangement of the works, and the space they created is indeed a beautiful one. The new wing is meant to be our civilization's ultimate tribute to the classical era. From the magic of the silvery drops of light that filter through the skylights, to the Roman mosaics illustrating the Odyssey and the colossal statues of the Nile and Augustus from Prima Porta. Pius VII also expanded the epigraphic collection in the lapidary gallery. Gregory XVI, Capillary, was considered a reactionary and an obscurantist by the liberal Italian press of the Risorgimento. Yet he proved himself to be a well-educated intellectual and a generous patron who took an interest in the artistic trends of his century. In fact, it was he who founded the Gregorian Etruscan Museum in 1837 and the Gregorian Egyptian Museum in 1839. The Gregorian Etruscan Museum displays finds from excavations in southern Etruria from 1828 onwards. Among its many masterpieces is the so-called Mars of Todi, the most beautiful and most celebrated bronze sculpture of ancient Italy. Besides the collections already in the Vatican and in the Capitoline Museum, the Gregorian Egyptian Museum contains archaeological findings from various expeditions to Egypt. Of particular interest is the Tapestry Gallery, which in 1838 was arrayed with a series of Flemish tapestries from what is called the Scuola Nuova, New School. These tapestries were executed in Peter van Aelst's workshop in Brussels after drawings done by Raphael's students during the time of Clement XII, 1523 to 1534. They first went on display 1531 in the Sistine Chapel. The tapestries of the Scuola Vecchia, Old School, are found in the Vatican Pinacoteca. They date from the time of Pope Leo X, 1513 to 1521, and were created from drawings by Raphael. Today, the gallery houses a collection of tapestries from various 16th and 17th century workshops. In 1838, in the room called the Sala di Sansone, commissioned by Pope Paul V in 1605 and frescoed by Guido Reni with stories of Samson, Pope Gregory XVI decided to display paintings of the Roman period. Among these is the Aldobrandine wedding, from which the room of the Aldobrandini wedding took its name. In 1844, Gregory XVI founded the Gregoriano Profano Museum inside the Lateran Palace. The exhibition offered extensive and valuable documentation of pagan-era Roman civilization, with statues, bas-reliefs, and mosaics discovered during the papal excavations carried out in prior decades. In and around Rome, Gervateri, Veio, and Ostia. These finds were displayed alongside many of the antiquities that had, until then, been kept in the Vatican's sculpture storage for lack of space in the Vatican Palace. In 1854, Pope Pius IX, a visionary supporter of the studies of early Christian Rome and the excavations of underground Christian Rome, founded the Pius Christian Museum in the Lateran Palace. The new museum brought together reliefs taken from the walls of the Sacred Museum of the Vatican Apostolic Library and numerous sarcophagi gathered from Rome's churches and from excavations of Sacri Cimetirii. The museum also features important early Christian artifacts and inscriptions. Also in 1854, Pope Pius IX proclaimed the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception and charged the famous painter from Ancona, Francesco Podesti, with frescoing an entire room in honor of the Madonna. This room is adjacent to Raphael's rooms. At the center of the Room of the Immaculate Conception is a richly ornamented bookcase containing the many translations of the papal bull Ineffabilis Deus. The Room of the Immaculate Conception underwent a major restoration in 2006 during Benedict XVI's papacy. It reopened in all its splendor for public viewing in 2007. In 1910, St. Pius X, who succeeded the last sovereign ruler of the Papal States, ordered the Jewish lapidarium to be placed in the Lateran Palace. The core of this collection consists of 137 inscriptions, most of which came from the cemetery on Via Portuense, known as the Jewish Catacomb of Monteverde. The inscriptions, donated by the property's owners, the Marquises Pellegrini Quarantati, were placed in the new Judaic Room. The inscriptions from the Jewish Catacomb of Monteverde now make up the largest and most consistent collection of funerary inscriptions from a Jewish community, and are an irreplaceable treasure for scholars. With his motu proprio Quoniam tam preclara of the 12th of November 1926, Pope Pius XI, Ratti, founded the Missionary Ethnological Museum to represent the non-European cultures of Asia, Africa, Oceania, and the Americas. The museum was inaugurated on the 21st of December 1927 in the Lateran Palace, where it would remain until 1963. The original core of the collection consisted of approximately 40,000 works from around the world. Pope Pius XI also commissioned a dedicated building for the Vatican Pinacoteca near the new entrance to the Vatican museums. This finally solved the problem of the lack of adequate space to display the paintings, which until then had to be continually moved around within the Apostolic Palace. The architect Luca Beltrami designed the new space in the 19th century square garden, a location that would promise the best possible lighting conditions for conserving and appreciating the paintings. The Pinacoteca was inaugurated on the 27th of October 1932. The current arrangement of the precious relics of the Sancta Sanctorum within the Chapel of St. Peter Martyr dates from Pius XI's papacy. The Sancta Sanctorum was the old chapel of the Lateran Palace, and the relics were found in 1905 in a wooden box dating from the reign of Leo III, 795 to 816. Pius XI's reign also created, in 1923, what is today the Painting and Wood Materials Restoration Laboratory, the oldest of the Vatican museums, restoration laboratories. Pius XI's predecessor, Pope Benedict XV, had founded the Pontifical Tapestry Workshop in 1915. In 1930, Pope Pius XI officially appointed the Franciscan Missionaries of Mary to take charge of conservation of the Vatican's important collection of tapestries. These early steps were the beginning of what is now the Tapestries and Textiles Restoration Laboratory. Then came the creation of the Vatican Museum's Scientific Applications Council, which is today the Diagnostic Laboratory for Conservation and Restoration, 1935, and the Mosaic Restoration Laboratory, late 1930s. In 1962, Pope John XXIII announced the decision to transfer the Lateran museums to the Vatican. A new building would be specially constructed for the collections of the Gregoriano Profano Museum, the Pius Christian Museum, and the Jewish Lapidarium. The Missionary Ethnological Museum was also moved. It was Pope Paul VI who finally approved the design of the new single building, able to house all the Lateran collections. Later, in 1970, the Pope also altered the general tour itinerary of the Vatican museums to include the Gregoriano Profano Museum and the Pius Christian Museum, and make them accessible for the public to admire. In 1973, he opened the new Missionary Ethnological Museum, now called the Ethnological Museum. Paul VI also worked to repair the rift that existed between the Church and contemporary figurative art. In 1973, he opened the collection of modern religious art, known today as the Collection of Contemporary Art. The collection attempts to offer the widest overview possible of the art produced during the last 2 centuries, in Europe and elsewhere. 1973 was also the year in which the Vatican's Historical Museum was opened. Now, let's start our tour at the Gregorian Egyptian Museum. Gregorian Egyptian Museum, Museo Gregoriano Egizio, founded by Pope Gregory XVI in 1839. The museum houses an extensive collection of artifacts from ancient Egypt. The material on display includes papyri, mummies, hieroglyphic inscriptions, the famous Book of the Dead, and the Grassi collection. Most of the material from Hadrian's Villa in Tivoli, and is arranged in 9 rooms, of which the last 2 house works from ancient Mesopotamia and Assyria. Room 1. There are collections of objects and monuments, steles, statues, various objects, with inscriptions dating from the Old Kingdom to the Christian era. Room 2. Objects of the funerary cult of ancient Egypt are exhibited. Room 3. Part of the decoration of the Serapeum of Hadrian's villa in Tivoli is reconstructed here. Room 4. The room collects copies of statues and bas-reliefs in imitation of Egyptian originals, but sculpted in Italy in the Roman imperial era to decorate temples or sacred places in Rome and its surroundings. Room VIII, Hemicycle, exhibition of Egyptian statues found in Rome and its surroundings, such as the colossi of Ptolemy II and Arsinoe II. Statues and sarcophagi are exhibited on the terrace of the hemicycle. Room 6, the collections of Egyptian bronzes dating back to the 14th century BC, which belonged to Carlo Grassi and donated to Pius XII by Netta Grassi, are on display. Room 7. It is entirely dedicated to Alexandria in Egypt and Palmyra in Syria, with objects from the Hellenistic Roman period, 4th century BC, 2nd century AD. Room 8. The room is dedicated to finds, pottery, weapons, flint blades, personal objects from Mesopotamia and pre-classical Syria-Palestine, 3 to 1 millennium BC. Room 9. It is divided into 4 sections, each dedicated to the reliefs that decorated the palace of an Assyrian ruler. Masterpieces in Gregorian Egyptian Museum. Statue of Osiris-Antinous. The statue represents Antinous, the favorite of the Emperor Hadrian, who died in the waters of the Nile, 130 AD. In the area where the tragic event occurred, the emperor founded the city of Antinopolis in his honor. Antinous was deified, and his cult as Osiris-Antinous rapidly spread through all the provinces of the empire, especially between 133 and 138 AD, the year of the emperor's death. Around 100 images of the youth are now known to archaeologists, who have classified them according to different typologies. The iconographic model of this statue is that of Osiris-Antinous, by which it was intended to express the regal and divine nature of the figure. Other statues of the same type have been unearthed at Hadrian's villa and are now dispersed in various museums throughout Europe. Their sacral aspect would reconnect them to the vast sacred area recently identified by archaeological excavations and known as the Antinuian, a special place of worship consecrated to the young man, and possibly also including his tomb, that emerges along the final stretch of the paved road that leads to the so-called Great Vestibule of Hadrian's villa. The statue, unearthed in 1740 at the Casino Micili, may instead have come from this area of worship, where the image of Antinous would have been associated with other Egyptian deities. Donated to Pope Benedict XIV, the statue was placed in the Capitoline Museum in 1742. Gregory XVI requested for it to be transferred to the Vatican in 1838, so it could be displayed in the new Egyptian Museum. False door funerary stele of Iri. Funerary stele, in the words of the Egyptians themselves, served to render living the name of the deceased and to guarantee life in the hereafter. Depicted in the act of receiving gifts and offerings from members of his family, the deceased always appears seated at a laden banqueting table. The false door stele, which developed from the more ancient custom of setting framed stele in the facade of a building, is found in the tomb, or more specifically, in the funeral chapel, a place accessible to the living and where the deceased was worshipped. In front of this door, living relatives deposited their offerings of food and drinks necessary for life in the hereafter. This stele belonged to Eri-Entrance, known as Eri, who was a priest of the cult of the Pharaoh Cheops, Dynasty IV, and superintendent of his pyramid at Giza, the most majestic ever built. Vatican Naophorous. The statue, already known in the 17th century as the Vatican Naophorous, depicts a figure named Udjahorasnet, holding a naos bearing the image of Osiris. Udjahorasnet has the titles of Chief Physician, Treasurer of the King of Lower Egypt, and Commander of the King's Fleet. Indeed, he lived between the end of Dynasty the 26th and the beginning of 27, during the period in which Egypt became a Persian satrapy. In the inscription carved on his long robe, he describes the Achaemenid kings as respectful towards Egyptian tradition, presenting an image of the Persian occupation contrary to what we find in Greek sources, which are strongly influenced by anti-Persian propaganda. The exact provenance of this statue is unknown, but it is assumed to have been found in the city of Sais in the Nile Delta. It was acquired without the head in 1738 and restored in 1783, with the addition of a non-pertinent head subsequently removed. Stele of Hatshepsut and Thutmose III. This sandstone stele was erected at the behest of Queen Hatshepsut to commemorate improvement and restoration works in West Thebes. The scene depicts the queen with a blue crown, in the act of offering 2 globular vases to the god Amon-Ra. She is accompanied by her nephew, the future pharaoh Thutmose III, who wears the white crown of Upper Egypt. The daughter of Thutmose I and the wife of Thutmose II, following the death of her husband Hatshepsut, reigned as co-regent with her very young nephew-stepson, Thutmose III, son of Thutmose II and a secondary princess. After a few years, the queen claimed royal titles and attributes, proclaimed herself pharaoh, and governed autonomously for 22 years. Upon the death of the queen, Thutmose III resumed the throne, condemning his aunt-stepmother to an inexorable damnatio memoriae, and ordering her name and likeness to be erased from every monument that represented her as pharaoh. The stele entered the Vatican in 1819 and dates from the period of the Regency. Coptic Stele. In the Coptic period, funerary stelae were part of the architectural layout of tombs, and funerary inscriptions kept alive the memory of the deceased among the living. Produced mostly in limestone and sandstone, although they are also found in marble, alabaster, granite, wood, and terracotta, they were usually placed inside a niche dug out of the mound that covered the tomb or arranged within burial chapels, but were at times placed directly on the ground to cover the pit. Homogeneous groups of funerary stelae, pertinent to different areas of the Egyptian territory, may be identified on the basis of their shape, the epigraphic formulae, and iconography. This stele has the typical characteristics of Middle Egyptian production. It is entirely without any figurative apparatus and has 24 inscribed lines, partly fragmented, reproducing a text in a Coptic language defined as being of the Latanic type, with a sequence of saints in hierarchical order. The highest rank is attributed to the two archangels, Michael and Gabriel, who are found at the beginning of the text. They are followed by the invocation of the Virgin Mary, the progenitors, Adam and Eve, the 24 elders, the patriarchs, the prophets, the apostles, the martyrs, the confessors, the archbishops, and the bishops, and then the list of holy monks, including Apollo, Phib, and Anup, the saints of the so-called triad of Bawit, and also Macarius, Moses, and Jeremiah. These precede a formula asking for mercy towards the deceased, whose name is Ptolemy. This is followed by the date of death, which is, however, no longer legible. The stele was found by the renowned English archaeologist W.M. Flinders Petrie in 1913. Although the context of its discovery is unknown, the mention of the saints of Bawit suggests that it may have come from a cemetery of the monastery located there. Sarcophagus of Djedmut. The sarcophagus belongs to Djedmut, singer of the god Amun-Ra of Karnak, and dates from the beginning of Dynasty the 22nd. In this historic period of serious economic crisis, the sarcophagus became the most important element in the grave goods. No longer the time of costly, richly decorated tombs. Instead, the iconographic and textual apparatus which once covered the tomb walls is transferred to the sarcophagus. Evident limits of space ensured that the scenes and texts were synthesized, occupying the entire available surface in a sort of horror vacui. The decoration of this sarcophagus is particularly elegant and refined, and is extraordinarily executed in every last detail. The grave goods of the age included an external sarcophagus, as in the case of the item in question belonging to Djedmut, an internal sarcophagus, recently discovered in the Museum of Rochelle in France, and a wooden cover placed directly over the mummy, now lost. The sarcophagus of Djedmut falls within the category of so-called yellow coffins, characterized by a decoration on a yellow background, a symbol of eternal regeneration, and a patina of translucent varnish of vegetable origin on the surface. Ushabti of the Pharaoh Seti I. This homogeneous group of 22 Ushabti funerary figurines is from the tomb of the Pharaoh Seti I, father of the great Ramesses II. The burial site, located in the Valley of the Kings, was discovered on the 16th of October, 1917, by Giovanni Battista Belzoni. It is still considered to be the most splendid royal burial site ever discovered. Although the tomb had been violated, some of the grave goods were still conserved inside. Among the items recovered, there were around 700 Ushabti, now dispersed in various collections throughout the world. It is likely that the Vatican specimens arrived directly from Belzoni himself, who also donated a group of papyri to the museum. These Ushabti were produced using several species of wood. They are mummiform with a tripartite hairpiece and the arms crossed on the chest. On the body, there is a hieroglyphic inscription containing the name of the sovereign and chapter 6 of the Book of the Dead. The Ushabti were covered with a glossy black substance, identified as a resin of vegetable origin conventionally known as black varnish, a symbol of survival beyond death. The figurines served as substitutes for the deceased, who called upon them to take his place working in the fields in the afterlife. They were produced in different materials and sizes, located inside boxes or placed next to the sarcophagus. But their function remains that of responding to the call of the deceased. Indeed, Ushabti means he who answers. Mummy of Amenirdis. The practice of embalming the body reached its maximum diffusion, also among the middle and lower classes of Egyptian society, at the time of Dynasty the 21st. The mummy displayed in the central display case of Room 2 provides evidence of this. The body of this woman, probably named Amenirdis, was first subjected to a process of evisceration and drying, and was then wrapped in bandages and covered with a shroud. Various amulets were then positioned on the shroud, as well as a mesh made with tapered faience beads, which are not, however, pertinent. In general, amulets for mummies were of different shapes and materials depending on their function, and could also be positioned among the bindings. They had a protective value but could also be used to substitute damaged parts of the body. For the Egyptians, the prevention of the natural decomposition of the body and its destruction after death was indispensable to guarantee eternal life. And the process of mummification followed a precise ritual lasting 70 days. The mummy of Amenirdis is displayed in what would have been its original painted wood sarcophagus, whose lid is also conserved. Fayum, portrait of a young man. The so-called Fayum portraits of the Roman age were placed on the mummy over the face and secured using bandages. Their symbolic value is that of a funerary mask of the pharaonic era, or rather, a substitute protection for the face, while the style and production technique are typically Roman. It takes the form of a wooden board painted with tempera or encaustic, which reproduce, in a naturalistic way, the face of the deceased. Their definition derives from the fact that the first specimens were discovered in large quantities in the area of Fayum. although they have also been found in other necropolises of Middle and Upper Egypt. This specimen depicts a young man looking slightly to the right. He wears a white robe with wide purple clavi and a cloak draped over his left shoulder. The style of the portrait, the facial features, and the characteristic hairstyle enable it to be dated from the first quarter of the 4th century AD. The portrait, previously part of the Gregor Stroganov collection, was part of the collection bequeathed to the Vatican Museums by Federico Zeri in 1999. Shroud of the Lady of the Vatican. This linen canvas, known as the Lady of the Vatican, belongs to a particular type of female burial shrouds of which there are only 6 known specimens, dispersed in various museums. The portrait of the deceased is not limited solely to the face, but instead depicts the full life-size figure of the woman. She is reclining, as may be seen by the position of her feet, which are elongated and rest on a cushion. She wears jewelry, executed in relief using plaster and gilded. The figurative panel is divided, in the upper part, by a series of concentric frames and friezes, and, in the lower part, by a frieze divided into rectangular areas with figurative illustrations, of which 2 are conserved. In the first, there is a scene of philosophical instruction with a teacher and young pupil, probably the deceased herself. In the second, of doubtful interpretation, there is what appears to be a fight between a young man and a lion. The shroud was discovered in 1900 by Albert Guyet in the site of Antinopolis and donated to Pope Leo XIII in 1902 by Émile Guimet, along with the corresponding mummy. The archaeological context of origin and an iconographical study of the portrait would date it from the 3rd century AD. The robe and jewels are typical of the Roman context, and the hairstyle in particular is inspired by the fashion of women of the Severian imperial house. Statua di Osiri-Apis. This bifrontal statue represents the god Osiris on one side and the bull Apis on the other. It was incorrectly restored in the 1700s with the attribution of a female bust, and is now displayed on a base in the form of a lotus flower, as it was recomposed by Jean-Claude Grenier. Antinous, favorite of the Emperor Hadrian, was deified after his death by drowning in the Nile. He would have been assimilated with the bull Apis, becoming Osiris, the god who died and rose again. Subsequently identified by the Ptolemies with Serapis, Alexandrian deity of salvation. The lotus flower from which the statue emerges is also a symbol of eternal regeneration. The statue was discovered during the excavations of 1736, during the papacy of Benedict XIV, 1740 to 1758, and then displayed in the Capitoline museums until 1838, when it was transferred to the new Gregorian Egyptian Museum at the behest of Pope Gregory XVI. Campana Plaque. This relief belongs to a group of artifacts, the so-called Campana reliefs, produced in the central Italic area, especially Rome and Latium. These were published for the first time in 1842 by the Marquis Giovanni Pietro Campana, 1809 to 1880, a notable figure among Roman collectors who undertook numerous excavations in Rome and in the surrounding area. The so-called Campana Museum, made up of terracottas of different types of Greek, Etruscan, Magno-Grecian, and Roman origin, was confiscated in 1859 by the papal authorities and divided among various museums, including the future Victoria and Albert Museum, the Hermitage, and the Napoleon III Museum. The clay plaques, which make up an important part of the collection, date from the mid-1st century BC to the mid-2nd century AD, and present a reworking of motifs from different traditions: Near Eastern, Greek, Egyptian, and Egyptian-inspired. The depiction of the Nile landscape is a very common theme, characterized by typical plants, crocodiles, hippopotamuses, storks, and pygmies guiding a boat, in accordance with the stereotypical image that the Romans had of Egypt and of the Nile Valley. It is likely that this reconstruction of the environment was used in a sacred context to contextualize the origin of various ritual practices. However, the place of discovery of these plaques, which would have enabled a more precise evaluation and interpretation, remains unknown. The Caco. This statue represents a figure with the head of a dog, an animal sacred to the god Thoth. It was discovered during the medieval age in Rome, in the area of the Serapeum of Campus Martius. The name of the church of Santo Stefano del Cacco, a Roman term meaning macaque, refers precisely to this monument. The sculpture is in fragments and would already have been damaged in ancient times, as shown by the presence of a hole that would have enabled a bolt to be inserted. Only the lower part of the statue remains, which shows the animal seated with its front limbs resting on the knees of its back legs. The tail lies along the plinth, which is also damaged. The work was produced by two Greek artists active in Rome, Phidias and Ammonios, according to the Greek inscription on the left side of the base. The Latin inscription on the right, instead, consists of the authorization to place the statue in the temple, dated 159 AD. Statue of the god Anubis. Anubis is among the most ancient and important deities of the Egyptian pantheon. He presided over mummification and burial rites, and was the lord of the necropolis. He was represented in Egyptian iconography as a jackal, or as a man with the head of a jackal. This statue offers eloquent testimony to a syncretic divine figure, Anubis, who, in the Roman context, was assimilated to Mercury. The god with its jackal's head, with a small solar disk on a crescent moon between its ears, wears a short tunic, a cloak and shoes, and holds the caduceus in his hand, in his function as the ferryman of the dead to the underworld. Psychopomp. The statue, discovered in Anzio on land belonging to the Pamphilj family in 1749, was donated to Pope Benedict XIV and was transferred to the Gregorian Egyptian Museum in 1839. Sculptural group from the Villa of Cassius. The statues, part of a sculptural group in an Egyptian-inspired style, were unearthed in 1779 during the papacy of Pius VI. They are from the Tiburtine Villa, incorrectly attributed to Cassius, the famous Roman politician who instigated the plot that led to the murder of Caius Julius Caesar, 44 DC. They may have been produced at the time of the Emperor Hadrian for a place of worship dedicated to Antinous and Zeus Cassios, a deity of Syrian origin, protector of sailors, whose cult was also established in Egypt in the city of Pelusium. Hadrian probably encountered the cult of Zeus Cassios during the time in which he held the role of Trajan's legate in 113 in northern Syria. And once he became emperor, he restored the god's temple in Pelusium, promoting the spread of the cult in the western Mediterranean. Head of Pharaoh Mentuhotep II. This head was part of a statue, carved from sandstone, of the Pharaoh Mentuhotep II, the unifier of Egypt. At the end of the so-called First Intermediate Period, at the end of the 3rd millennium BC, and whose name is written on the back supporting pillar. The face is painted dark red to render the idea of the skin color of a male figure, a convention typical of Egyptian figurative art. This sculpture is an extraordinary example of monumentary Egyptian portraiture, and probably came from his burial temple in Deir el-Bahari in West Thebes. Considered illegitimate in some pharaonic king lists, Mentuhotep II promoted the construction of numerous architectural works, including temples and chapels, especially in Upper Egypt. Mentuhotep, like the other sovereigns of his dynasty, effectively governed the country from the city of Thebes. Unlike the pharaohs of Dynasty XII, who chose Lisht in Lower Egypt as the capital of the kingdom. The founder of Dynasty XII, Amenemhat, served as a vizier Mentuhotep II. Baboons from the Temple of Karnak. The two statues offer a canonical representation of a baboon, Papio Hamadryas L, seated on a plinth with its front paws resting on its knees, the hind legs apart, the sexual attributes clearly highlighted, and the tail coiled against the right flank. The eyes of specimen number 22,651 were probably produced in another material, while those of number 22,652 were rendered in relief with engraved details. The ample pelt of the bust is presented in both cases as a thick, compact mass characterized by scale-like elements, while on the chest there is a plate, empty and in the form of a naos in number 22,651, rectangular and smooth in number 22,652. The two baboons are in an excellent state of conservation, with the surface slightly abraded but with abundant remains of red color, especially in number 22,652, on the snout and up to the side tufts, on the sex and on the paws. Comparison with similar statues of baboons discovered in situ in the area of the Temple of Khnonsu at Karnak has enabled it to be deduced that such depictions represent a hypostatic aspect of the god Khonsu in Thebes, a deity assimilated during the New Kingdom, in a particular form of the god Thoth, whose animal hypostasis was indeed the baboon. Group with Ptolemy II. Discovered in 1714 in Rome, in Vigna Veraspi, the ancient site of Sallust, the statues portray, according to the traditional pharaonic iconography, Ptolemy II and his sister wife, Arsinoe II. Originally erected in Heliopolis, they were consecrated by the Lagid sovereign to celebrate the deification of Arsinoe, following her premature death in the year 15 of Ptolemy. It is believed that the two statues were brought to Rome, along with the statue of Queen Tuya, cat, 22,678 by the Emperor Caligula, who had them erected in the gardens of Sallust to decorate a building consecrated to his royalty and to his sister wife Drusilla, who had also died prematurely and was deified in the same way as Ptolemy II had deified his sister wife Arsinoe. To reinforce the parallel with Ptolemy II, Caligula ordered the production of a second statue of Arsinoe II, which he consecrated, however, to his sister Drusilla, cat, 22,683. Statue of Queen Tuya. This work, sculpted during Dynasty XVIII with the features of Queen Tiye, wife of Amenhotep III, was usurped and reused during the Dynasty XIX by Ramesses II, who dedicated it to his mother Tuya. This queen, who had an important political and court role, received after her death a funerary cult associated with that of her son in the so-called Ramesseum, the burial site of Ramesses, situated in West Thebes, where this statue would originally have been erected. On the left side of the dorsal pillar, the Princess Hennetmeyer is depicted, described in the brief inscription as the royal daughter or the royal wife. Considered in the past to have been one of the daughters of Ramesses II, Hennetmeyer has now been identified as one of the pharaoh's sisters, possibly the daughter of the same father, Seti I. Her statue would have been brought to Rome and placed in the gardens of Sallust of the Emperor Caligula, along with the statues of Ptolemy II, Arsinoe II, and Drusilla Arsinoe. It was unearthed in 1714 in the gardens of Vigna Verospi and entered the Vatican upon the foundation of the new Egyptian Museum in 1839. Statue of the god Bes. Bes, the Egyptian protector of infants and expectant mothers, is distinguished by his unusual iconography. The body is stocky, the legs are bowed, and the face is similar to a mask, with a snarling mouth, protruding tongue, and the large swollen eyes marked by deep lines. In this specimen from the Roman age, there are various traditional features, such as the low forehead, the short snub nose, and the fan-shaped beard. The god is, however, shown here seated on a rock, with his hands resting on his knees, as in the other two examples unearthed in Rome, and now preserved in the Museo Barocco and in the Fitzwilliam Museum, Cambridge. The mouth was probably readjusted in the modern age, and the upper lip appears to protrude, in contrast to the traditional Egyptian iconography. On the head there is a hole, which would have housed a metal attribute or a bolt that would have supported another stone element, possibly the feathered headdress typical of Bes. A lion's pelt covers the head and back and is tied at the mouth. The lion's forepaws rest on the god's shoulders, while the lower paws are positioned at the side against his thighs. The name is rendered in the form of a crest, with large, separate locks extending along his back. He wears a bulla around his neck, an unusual attribute for this deity in the Egyptian context, but which in the Roman world was associated with childhood and had apotropaic value. This detail confirms the understanding and assimilation on the part of Roman culture of the original meaning of this deity. The statue was acquired in 1814 by the antiquarian Francesco de Santis. Anthropomorphic statue of the god Apis. The statue depicts the god Apis with a human body and a bull's head. The arms, the lower part of the body, and the legs are missing. However, the god was probably depicted in a standing position, holding his right arm in front of him, holding the scepter, or was, symbol of power, conserved in the upper part, and with his left arm by his side. Between the horns there is a solar disk, while around the neck there is a chain of several delicately engraved rows. The bull Apis was one of the most important deities of ancient Egypt, and his cult dates back to the first dynastic periods. He was mainly venerated in Memphis, where he was linked to the god Pura as his living image and the manifestation of his glorious soul. Only one sacred bull Apis existed on earth, as the hypostasis of the god Ptah, born of a virgin cow united with the god Ptah, and he lived within his temple. He could be recognized by various white spots and, as the Greek historian Herodotus recounts, was killed at the age of 25, and upon his death, the priests searched all the land for the new divine incarnation. When dead, the bull Apis united with the god Osiris in the form of Osiris-Apis, the Serapis of the Hellenistic age, and was buried at Saqqara in the so-called Serapeum, inside a gigantic stone sarcophagus, embalmed and endowed with rich grave goods. The theology of the god Apis is structured according to a cycle bearing a dual meaning. On the one hand, Apis personifies the strength of the pharaoh, able to govern the cosmos, while on the other, he becomes a symbol of Osirian rebirth. The statue of Apis in the Vatican possibly came from the canopus of Hadrian's villa, but it is not known with certainty if the work was brought to Italy in ancient times or in the 18th century. In 1779, the Vatican Museums acquired it from Francesco Piranesi, son of Giovanni Battista, the celebrated engraver who owned one of the most renowned collections of antiquities of the 1700s. It was initially located in the Gallery of the Candelabra and subsequently displayed in the new Gregorian Egyptian Museum. Statue of the lioness goddess Sekhmet. The statue represents the lioness goddess Sekhmet and constitutes a single statuary group, one of the most imposing of all the history of pharaonic Egypt. It is made up of two types of statue of the same size. The goddess, seated on a throne with the solar disk and Uraeus on the head and the Ankh in the left hand. The standing goddess, crowned in the same way, has the Ankh in her right hand and the Uadj in the left. The statues were produced for the pharaoh Amenhotep III to adorn the precinct of his funerary temple in West Thebes. Subsequently, starting from the Ramesside period, some of these statues were reused and transferred to other places, both in the valley and in the delta. One of the most significant transfers was carried out during Dynasty the 21st, when the high priest of Amo and future sovereign Pinujum I had dozens of these statues moved to the temple of the goddess Mut in Karnak. The pharaoh Sheshonq I had his cartouche inscribed on some of them. The statues have hieroglyphic inscriptions on the base or on the throne and on the dorsal pillar, which assign numerous and different epithets to the goddess. Together, these epithets, of which there are believed to be 365, one for each day of the year, would constitute a litany in stone, with which the pharaoh wished to pacify the goddess under her 365 different denominations. The specimens displayed in the Gregorian Egyptian Museum were discovered by the Roman traveler Silvestro Guidi in the first decades of the 19th century, presumably in the same precinct of the temple to Mut in Karnak. Lions of Nectanebo. The two lions date from the reign of Nectanebo I and the long inscription on the plinth would suggest they were originally located at Rewe, likely to correspond to Hermopolis Parva in the Delta, present-day Tel Baklia. Here the pharaoh had built a shrine to the god Thoth, he who separates the two contenders. This epithet derives from the mythological account of the dispute between the gods Horus and Set for Osiris, legacy on earth, in which Thoth separates, or rather reconciles them. Nectanebo would have represented the two deities reconciled, symbol of a single and strong reign over Upper and Lower Egypt. In the Roman imperial age, the two sculptures were transferred to Rome to be placed in front of the Pantheon, or, according to another hypothesis, to decorate the temple to Isis at Campus Martius. The lions were rediscovered during the papacy of Eugene IV in the 15th century. They were placed on two columns in front of the Pantheon at the behest of Pope Clement XII, and subsequently used to decorate the fountain of Aqua Felice at the baths of Diocletian under Pope Sixtus V, 1586. Upon request of Pope Gregory XVI, they were substituted by a copy in 1839, and the originals were placed in the new Egyptian Museum. Urn for the mummy of a cat. Bronze cats of this type were votive offerings enclosing the mummy of a cat. The animal was generally killed when young by strangulation or by fracturing the spinal column. Many bronze cats were found in the necropolises, especially at Bubastis, the city of the cat goddess Bastet, but also in other towns in Middle and Upper Egypt. This goddess, originally a terrifying lioness, was adored in the form of a benevolent cat, which had to be tranquilized regularly through ritual. The daughter of the sun god, she was identified with the Eye of Ra, which destroys his eternal enemy, the snake Apep. Venerated from the Old Kingdom in the city of Bubastis, present-day Tel Basta, in the eastern delta, her cult was most widespread in the late and Greek-Roman age. In her temple, extended over the centuries, a great feast was held in her honor, which the Greek historian Herodotus describes as one of the most magnificent. This specimen in bronze portrays a cat, slightly larger than life-size, seated on its hind legs. The eyes, now lost, were made of vitreous paste or stone, and the ears are pierced to enable earrings to be inserted, also lost. The engraved decoration consists of a chain of shells, alternated with spherical pearls, from which an Ujiat eye is suspended as a symbol of regeneration, and a hemispherical breastplate topped with a lion's head, possibly referring to the goddess Bastet as a lioness. A scarab, also a symbol of regeneration, is engraved on the head. The remains of the linen strips that originally bound the statuette are also conserved on it, attached to the surface with a resinous substance. The object entered the Vatican in 1847, along with other bronze urns and cat mummies. Statuette of an ibis. The statuette depicts a crouching ibis, a manifestation of the god Thoth, one of the most important deities of the Egyptian pantheon, whose main shrine was situated in the city of Hermopolis Magna in Middle Egypt. The animal's head, tail, and feet are in bronze, whereas the body is made of plastered and gilded wood. It is notable for the particularly refined anatomical rendering of the head, with inlaid vitreous paste for the eyes, as well as the tail and the plumage. The feet are modeled realistically and with particular care. The statuette would have contained the mummy of an ibis. On occasions such as feast days and processions, the priests of the cult would take statuettes like this one from the temple to Thoth in Hermopolis to the nearby sacred necropolis of Tuna el Gebel, where they were placed in underground tunnels. The custom of mummifying animals considered sacred and making votive statuettes became very popular during the Late Age, although the practice was also known in more distant times and continued even under Roman rule. Stele of Horus on crocodiles. The stele, owing to its decoration, belongs to the category of Stele of Horus on crocodiles. On the front, there is the figure of the god Horus as a boy, standing with his feet on two crocodiles depicted frontally, and holding dangerous animals in his hands, symbolizing his triumph over the forces of evil. At the top, there is often the head of the god Bes, protector of children and births, as in the specimen conserved in the Vatican. This iconography, with the boy god represented frontally as a plump child, was affirmed at the beginning of the Ptolemaic Age, a period during which this type of magic stele became widespread. Specifically, the head engraved on the edges of the stele and on the reverse side recount a tale of magic. Horus, mortally wounded by the sting of a scorpion, is saved by the magic formulas of his mother Isis, goddess of magic. The thaumaturgical virtues of the object, expressed in the formulas and in the images depicted, were activated by magic. And to be cured, the person affected by a scorpion sting or snake bite would have to drink the water first poured over this stele and then gathered. The sting of the scorpion was a scourge during the Egyptian campaigns and a frequent cause of death. Situla. The situla is a ceremonial vessel used for daily temple ritual and for private funerary worship. Indeed, a number of situlae have been found inside tombs, and it would seem they are depicted within burial sites, in scenes of funeral processions and offerings to the deceased. The situla contained milk for the aspersions carried out during the funeral procession that took the sarcophagus to the burial site. Milk was also offered to the deceased for his or her rebirth and sustenance, along with the water used for libation on the table of offerings as a rite of purification. The situla displayed in room 6 is pear-shaped, with a curved lower part and movable arched handle. On the lower part of its belly, it depicts a scene of worship. On the left, there are the gods Isis and Osiris, while on the right there is the deceased Kriya, son of Kenenkes and Asukra, as indicated on the inscription engraved next to him. In the center, there is a table laden with offerings. The object was acquired by the antiquarian Giuseppe Baseggio in 1840. Censer. During rituals, the offering of incense formed part of the purifications and was often associated with libations of water. The custom of burning incense, turpentine resin in most cases, or frankincense, myrrh, or styrax, was also sometimes motivated by practical considerations, as the shrine in which the statue of the god resided within the temple was closed, without the possibility of an exchange of air, making it necessary to purify the environment. This type of censer, Horus, arm, is made up of a long handle in the form of a papyrus stem, symbol of prosperity and rebirth, ending with the falcon's head of the god Horus at one end. On the arm, there is a small figure of the pharaoh, kneeling, ideally in front of the deity to whom the offering was destined, and resting his hands on a small receptacle in the form of a cartouche in which the spare incense was placed. The incense powder was burned in a small dish placed on the open hand at the end of Horus' arm. The small pallet used to place the incense in the drawer has also been conserved. This specimen bears a brief inscription in Demotic, partly illegible due to wear, positioned between the falcon's head and the central incense tray. The name Imhotep recurs twice and can be identified with the architect Imhotep who designed the pyramid of Djeser in Saqqara. The presence of this name, according to scholars, may link the object to a precise geographical context, Saqqara, or more generally, the area of Memphis, where the cult of Imhotep was particularly widespread in the Greek-Roman age. Alexandrian terracottas. These figurative terracottas were produced in Alexandria in the Ptolemaic and Roman age. They represent deities, protectors, animals, vases, theatrical masks, caricatures, and people of different ethnic types who came to animate the streets of the Ptolemaic capital, which rapidly became the most important cultural center of all the Mediterranean. Among the artifacts, there are some which are notable for their lively Greek-Egyptian eclecticism, the result of a current of a more authentically Alexandrian art of popular taste, as well as those of a more typically Greek flavor, expressed with greater stylistic and iconographic refinement. Within this vast range of production, there is a notable group of figurines, with often caricaturized facial features, as in the case of the head number 37,563, with its snub nose and large lips. This work, although produced serially using molds, is noteworthy for its expressiveness and impressive realism. These figurines had various uses. They were left in temples ex voto or conserved at home, where they were placed in domestic lararia or shrines to domestic gods to protect dwellings and people, but could also be used to decorate furniture and walls. The terracottas conserved in the Gregorian Egyptian Museum are from two distinct collections. The first to have been obtained was acquired following the exhibition of Catholic missions in Turin in 1898 as a gift from the Franciscan missions of Upper Egypt. The second was donated in 1951 by Netta Grassi, widow of the wealthy Italian industrialist Carlo Grassi, who had acquired the items on the Egyptian antiquarian market before 1940. Palmyran burial reliefs. The reliefs, which date from between the 2nd and 3rd century AD, come largely from the Federico Z bequest, which entered the Vatican Museum's collections in 1999. They originate from Palmyra, an important caravan city in the Syrian desert, which developed significantly between the 1st and 3rd centuries AD. Representing a sort of neutral territory between Rome and Persia and connecting the Mesopotamic East with the Mediterranean West. Although it became a Roman colony, it always maintained substantial economic autonomy. It was finally destroyed and looted of its riches in 272 by the Emperor Aureliano, who reduced it to a simple village. The city is surrounded by necropolises, which include 3 types of tomb. Those in the form of a tower belonging to the city's aristocratic class, and the mound and underground types for the middle classes who grew rich through trade and for the people at large. The loculi inside the tower and underground tombs were sealed with limestone slabs decorated with a likeness of the deceased, generally identified by an Aramaic inscription engraved above the shoulders. These burial reliefs offer documentary evidence fundamental for reconstructing the social fabric of this flourishing city. The female portraits in particular offer an abundance of ornaments that may be subdivided into well-defined parures, and which are presented as reworkings of fashions and models, influenced by the Hellenistic Roman West and the Parthian Sassanid East. Cuneiform tablet. The Sumerians, the most ancient inhabitants of Mesopotamia, invented writing in the 4th millennium BC to support the various economic activities that were becoming increasingly urgent in the most ancient urban centers. Clay tablets, used as a support, were engraved with a pointed stylus. After engraving, the tablets were baked in the sun or fired in a furnace. Tablet D714, in particular, bears the text regarding the sale of a piece of land, in which there also repeatedly appears the name of the god Enlil, Lord of the Wind, the principal deity of the city of Nippur. Entire administrative archives and libraries of tablets present us with a lively and direct account of the historic and political events, social and economic organization, mythology and religion of the peoples of Mesopotamia, Western Iran, Turkey, and Syria. Thanks to the syllabic nature of its signs, cuneiform script, which originated for writing Sumerian, was then used from the middle of the 3rd millennium BC for the Semitic language of the new inhabitants of Mesopotamia, the Akkadians. It was subsequently used for Babylonian, Amorite, Aramaic, and Assyrian, Semitic languages and dialects, as well as for Hittite, an Indo-European language, and Hurrian, an agglutinative language difficult to classify. Cylindrical seal. Cylindrical seals were used from the 3rd millennium BC in Mesopotamia to authenticate and seal documents. The functionary responsible for the operation in question would use the cylinder as a signature and carried it suspended around his neck. They were made of hard stones, often precious or semi-precious, such as steatite, andesite, lapis lazuli or cornelian, or of bone, ivory, and in some cases wood, and were engraved with mythological, symbolic, ritual, or heraldic images. The historical development of Mesopotamian glyptic arts enables us to trace the evolution of the themes represented in the seals. The selection displayed illustrates the late Uruk period up to the Persian age, 3300 to 333 BC. Specimen D-184, engraved in Akkadian language, shows a scene of presentation with male deities. The bifrontal vizier, Usmu, stands before the god Ea, depicted in his dwelling surrounded by water. There is another figure, a kneeling standard-bearer, at the entrance of the god's house. Cylinder of Nebuchadnezzar II. Perforated cylinder in baked clay, commemorating the building works conducted by King Nebuchadnezzar II, 605 to 562 BC, in the temple complex of the city of Murad, modern Tel Wanat es-Sadun, situated to the south of Baghdad. The temple was named Igikalama, the temple eye of the country, and was dedicated to Lugal-Marada, hypostasis of the god Ninurta. As the inscription explains, during his works, Nebuchadnezzar II rediscovered the deposit of the foundation laid by the Akkadian king Naram-Sin, 2254 to 2218 BC, which was reintegrated into the new foundation along with the new deposits of the Neo-Babylonian king. Respect for and protection of traces of the past were typical features of the Mesopotamian forma mentis. As suggested by the presence of a hollow part inside the cylinder, it was probably inserted onto a support and used as a decorative architectural element, imbued with strong ideological meaning. Alternatively, the cylinders could also be buried in the deposits in the foundations of the building, thus assuming an important apotropaic function. Pottery from the necropolis of Jericho. Jericho, Tel es-Sultan, is one of the most ancient and long-surviving sites of the Near East. Near the settlement, inhabited more or less uninterruptedly from 10,000 BC to the 16th century AD, there is one of the largest necropolises of the region, used throughout the whole of the Bronze Age. There is a sector occupied by the cemetery of the early Bronze Age IV, the period in Palestinian history in which the population of the region abandoned the system of urban life to return to the agricultural village economy. The group of vessels on display dates from this phase, from 2300 to 2000 BC, and exemplifies a very characteristic category of grave goods. The materials originate from 6 clearly identifiable tombs and constitute an important point of departure for research and the reconstruction of the culture of the early Bronze Age IV in Jericho. The selection consists of jugs, dishes, goblets, cups, oil lamps, and pots. Of these latter, various different types may be identified. Aside from 18 ceramic vessels, there is also a bronze dagger, D1022, and a knife and bolt made from a copper arsenic alloy, D1305, D1302. Clay figure. This terracotta figurine entered the collection in 2001, along with other objects from the collection of MSgar Salvatore Garofalo. Its certain provenance, Palestine, confers particular scientific value to the item, considering the rarity of specimens of clay human figures pertinent to the area and from the first centuries of the second millennium. The figurine was modeled by hand using mixed techniques, with the bust and head produced on a flat surface and the limbs worked in the round. It is precisely the position of the arms and legs that constitutes a particularly useful indication for its interpretation, also attributing a unique character to the object in the context of contemporary local production. Indeed, examples of choroplastic works from the same period show human figures with their arms open horizontally in the form of a cross and subsequently folded over the chest. In the Vatican specimen, the arms are held in front of the figure, holding or offering something held in the hands. From close observation of the legs, positioned with the feet apart, and the lower ends of the work, it emerges that these could not have constituted a stable support, indicating that the statuette was not intended to be placed in a standing position. It is believed that this object served a ritual function and would have been hidden, probably following a ritual combustion, of which visible traces remain. Relief with winged genius. The reign of Ashur-nasir-pal II, 883 to 859 BC, marked the first great flowering of Neo-Assyrian figurative art, as shown by the decoration of his monumental royal palace at the northwestern extreme of the Acropolis of Nimrud, ancient Kalku. The relief originates from room 1 of the palace and belongs to a series of tablets dedicated to the mythical symbolic theme of the adoration of the sacred tree, symbol of royalty bearing fruitfulness and life. The protector genius has the body of a man with long hair flowing over his shoulders, curling at the ends like his beard. He wears an ornate headdress with 2 pairs of stylized horns, a divine symbol, and a long frilled robe. His feet are bare, and the 2 large wings of an eagle, well modeled and finely detailed, emerge from his shoulders. Brick with inscription of Sargon II. A complete commemorative inscription in Sumerian language is engraved on this brick in 5 lines. It originates from the royal palace of Sargon II, 721 to 705 BC at Khorsabad, and celebrates the construction of the city and of the palace itself. Sargon, king of the universe, built this city. Dur-Sharrukin, the fortress of Sargon is its name. Within, he had this unrivaled palace built. Relief with Assyrian soldiers. This fragment of a relief originates from room 48, panel 12, of the southwest palace of Sennacherib, 704 to 681 BC, and belongs to a larger sculptural illustration of a city in the west, probably located in Syria, being seized by the Assyrian army. The 2 soldiers are part of a procession of armed men who, leaving the city gates, carry furnishings and other goods as loot. Relief with Arab tent set alight. This fragment of a relief was part of a more extensive sculptural illustration celebrating the victories of King Ashurbanipal, 680 to 636 BC, against the nomads of the Syro-Arabic desert, and, in particular, against the first Arab tribes known in the region. A dromedary on the right carries a mortally wounded Arab on its back, and the bodies of killed Arabs can be seen inside a tent at the lower left, which is about to be set alight by an Assyrian soldier with a torch in his hand, depicted in the center. This fragment of decoration originates from the Arab room of the North Palace of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh, and joins at the right side with a relief held in the British Museum. Relief with the Siege of Bitbunaki. This relief, recomposed from 2 fragments, depicts the siege of the Elamite city of Bitbunaki by the Assyrian soldiers of Ashurbanipal. The name of the city is included in the inscription, perfectly conserved, at the top right of the fragment. The scene is dominated by the defensive city wall, with towers and battlements, under attack by groups of armed soldiers wearing helmets and various forms of armor. On the left, on a long ladder propped against the wall, 4 figures move, armed with javelins. At the top of the wall, an Assyrian strikes the enemy who falls below. At the bottom, some soldiers remove stones from the defensive wall to create a gap, enabling them to conquer the city. The relief originates from Room F, the room of the Susiana, in the North Palace of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, and revisits themes already explored by the kings Ashurbanipal II, 883 to 859 BC, Salmanazar II, 858 to 824 BC, and Sennacherib, 704 to 681 BC.